Well, good afternoon, everybody. I believe we are now live. My name is Tony Juniper. It's my absolute pleasure and privilege to chair this panel this afternoon, where we're going to be hearing from two wonderful panelists, Georgie Bray from the RSPB and George Mayhew from the Endangered Landscape Programme. You hopefully have had a chance to look at the wonderful videos they prepared before this afternoon session. Before we get into the Q&A proper, I'm just going to invite Georgie and George just to say a little bit about their work, because they bring highly complementary perspectives, and maybe just hear in their own words just for a moment before we dive in. Georgie, would you like to say a little bit about what you do at Hope Farm?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Tony. So I work at RSPB's Hope Farm, which is an arable farm just west of Cambridge. And our aims are to demonstrate wildlife-friendly and productive farming, and trialing different methods to see how we can really work with nature to farm sustainably for the future.
Thank you, Georgie. And George, a little bit about the Endangered Landscapes Programme and your work there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, apologies in advance for the confusion with there being two Georginas on the panel. We've tried to distinguish between ourselves. So yeah, I work for the Endangered Landscapes Programme, which is managed by the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, who are hosting this Earth Optimism event. And it's kind of a collaborative programme which cuts across all of our CCI partners. So we're primarily a grant-making programme. As the Endangered Landscapes Programme, we fund large-scale restoration initiatives across Europe. And I guess really what the ELP represents is an evolution of sorts, I guess, of how we think about conservation. So trying to move away from this idea of trying to cling on to the biodiversity that we have left and actually be a bit more ambitious than that and say, no, we want to restore biodiversity and restore ecosystems to their full potential for the benefit of nature and people. And also, you know, thinking about the scale that we're operating at, these are really large scale initiatives that we're talking about, which are really exciting. And I hope many of you managed to see a couple of those examples in the video that was premiered early today. And yeah, look forward to sharing more about what our projects are doing.
Well, thank you both very much. We're just waiting for the questions to start coming through. I'm just wondering, just as we await the participants to give us a few thoughts, whether either of you have any views on this word of rewilding. It's creeping into the conversation a lot these days. And given where you're both coming from, one on the sustainable food side and the other on the ecosystem restoration side, whether you think that particular discussion around rewilding is helping or hindering, because one of the things I certainly pick up in my work at Natural England is how some in the farming community, they react quite badly to that word. And I just wonder what you both think about that. Georgie, maybe you've got some views there, working in that farming context.
Yeah, so when you say farming and rewilding, one of the first places I think of is NEP. Yeah, which is quite an amazing place, what they've achieved for biodiversity, the population of turtle doves that are at risk of extinction in the country, to there through the scrub system, the grazing systems and things they have there is amazing. It does, in that instance, it accepts that there will be a lower productivity level coming from that land in terms of food, but there are lots of other things that farmland can do as well. We're not just food producers. We can look after soil, sequester carbon and provide homes for diversity. But then at the farm scale, us at Hope Farm here are on the higher productivity end of the scale, nutrient-rich soils, big fields. But then we've got lots of pockets of rewilded spaces in the unproductive corners and our hedgerows and things. And so we try and make the most of those.
Thank you, Georgie. George, do you have a perspective on that subject?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's such an interesting debate, and I think as a programme, to be honest, you know, we've had conversations amongst ourselves about, you know, do we use the word rewilding? Do we refer to it as restoration? I guess for me, I think it's important to make a distinction between rewilding and restoration. So for me, restoration is kind of It's an umbrella term for recovery, for bringing something back to its more natural state or its original state. And so that being an umbrella term, rewilding is a form of restoration. So all rewilding is restoration, not all restoration is rewilding, if that makes sense. And I think from my understanding of what we mean by rewilding, I think rewilding appears to come from more of a really taking a step back, like letting nature look after itself at a large scale, whereas restoration can be on a bit of a spectrum and may still involve quite a bit of human intervention, especially if you're looking at kind of a smaller scale, whether that might be removing scrub or straightening, I don't know, re-meandering rivers, that kind of thing. I think I try not to get too bogged down in definitions. I think it's important to have some healthy discussion around these topics, and I do think it's unfortunate that rewilding has kind of become such a controversial term. Having said that, I do know of a few rewilding groups and networks, and I've had conversations with them before and said, oh, you're positioning yourself as a rewilding network or a rewilding project, does that concern you? And they've said, actually, it's a word that we want to reclaim, because rewilding in itself isn't supposed to be about excluding humans. So actually we want to reclaim the term for what it's supposed to be. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting debate.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you both. And like all single words, it's always open to interpretation. Certainly, for what it's worth, at Natural England, we've taken the view that from our perspective, and we've got a pretty broad purview of all of this, is that the phrase which is most useful is nature recovery, which can embrace rewilding, but also can refer to what we need to be doing in farmed landscapes and also highly managed habitats like meadows, which if you left them to go wild, you wouldn't have a meadow for very long. Anyway, so we're getting some questions coming through now, and we have one from Jane here, who's watched the videos and is interested to know whether the panelists think Brexit is going to make things easier or harder. Georgie, I guess you're in the thick of it there with the revisions to the Common Agricultural Policy. What's your perspective? You may have others apart from that policy area, of course.
Yeah, so it could be in some ways an exciting opportunity. So the Common Agricultural Policy many years ago sort of it paid farmers to increase levels of production, and that did a lot of damage as marginal areas of land that provided really important spaces for diversity and actually weren't that efficient for growing food. They were brought into production. And then the current system that we're under now, you can voluntarily get paid to put these marginal areas aside for conservation purposes, which is what we do at Hope Farm. But then a lot of the money still comes on an area basis. The movement now to paying, now we're out of, with Brexit, we're able to change that whole policy quite dramatically, and are with the idea of paying farmers for the public services is really exciting. If it means that money is moved over to doing things that are going to improve the sustainability of our farming systems, help us to make sure that wildlife has got a space for nature, then brilliant. But there is also a concern that we don't have the right level of ambition. So we're redressing the current policies and paying for the same old thing when the same old thing isn't actually working. And we need to support more farmers to restore our soils, to restore wildlife. So yeah, it depends where things go, really.
Yes, indeed. An unfrozen moment, it was described as by a former Secretary of State when we looked at these new policies, and what we have to do is it's unfrozen, is get it to flow in the right direction, which a lot of people are trying to do. George, from your point of view, I guess, with your project portfolio spanning quite a lot of EU countries, as well as one that recently left the EU, I dare say you'll be able to see some differences now. How does it look from your point of view?
Yeah, so for our funding, in terms of the countries that are eligible for ELP funding, that's not to do with whether they're in or outside of the EU. It's whichever country sits geographically within Europe. So in terms of our funding to projects, it doesn't really make a difference. They would still be eligible as long as they're geographically in Europe. In terms of the impact of Brexit, so I think as Georgie was saying, it kind of depends. There's a lot of potential opportunities there. It just depends how the government uses them. So I think I'm right in saying, you'll probably know this, Tony, I think something like 70-ish% of our environmental policy that we had came from the EU. So there was a question, I think, more, yeah. So I think there was a question when the referendum happened of, well, what's going to happen? Is that going to be a copy and paste job into UK policy? Can we do something more with that? Are they going to be weakened when they move over to UK level policy? I mean, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this. I don't know that I've been completely reassured that things will be better in terms of EU policy. I think there's a huge opportunity around the Common Agricultural Policy, where it seemed as though people were paid for production and not so much how the land was used. I think there's a new payment coming out. Is it the Environmental Land Management ELM scheme or something, where it's, as Georgie was saying, talking about paying for kind of public goods? I think that has great potential and gives farmers not just the incentive, but actually a viable option for setting aside some of their land. We can't expect people to just set aside land just because it's good for bees and butterflies and birds, as lovely as that is. Like, it has to pragmatically work for them. In terms of what I think will make it harder is the fact that, at least for the UK, for UK-based projects, they now won't have access, I don't think, to EU funding, and the EU holds a lot of potential funding for conservation and environmental work, which you won't have access to. And I'm concerned that, from even a research point of view, that will that mean that we have less access as part of these great collaborative projects with other EU countries? That's not to say it will happen, but that's my concern about what it does for our research.
Thank you. Evidently a great deal in play, and it's still being worked through, isn't it? Because we don't have all the policy clarity yet, but I think inevitably this is going to be, in the end, really a political question, and the extent to which the governments that now lead us into this post-EU period are going to keep conservation and nature on the top of the agenda. And that's going to include the level of funding coming in, because we will lose significant sources of money that were coming through the LIFE programme, for example, and whether that's going to be replaced or not, we have to wait and see. Certainly from where I sit, the words sound good in terms of what the government is suggesting it wants to do. So another cause for optimism there. Let's hope so. Right, now we have an anonymous attendee who asks, what do you think about the Trees for Climate project and how this can be filtered into wider conservation projects? Now, probably what's being talked about here, maybe something else, but we have the new tree planting ambition in this country, 30,000 hectares a year, backed by a very significant amount of money, actually, in the form of the Nature for Climate Fund, £640 million announced recently. And you can imagine that indeed this is what's going on. There are some people who are talking about natural regeneration and using that money for rewilding native woodlands. And there are other people, of course, who would like to spend that money on commercial timber production. And the question is, how do we navigate it into something which is going to achieve multiple outcomes? I don't know if either of you have any views on that subject and how we might harness tree planting for climate change purposes for wider ends.
I do, but George, if you want to go first.
I can do, yeah, sure, thanks. Yeah, so I'm not familiar with the Trees for Climate project itself, but I think in the kind of concept of tree planting, my general view is that we have to think about the scale that this is happening at. I think you have to have a kind of, ecologist, I don't know the sort of minimum scale, but I think there is a minimum scale for it to be beneficial. If it depends what your purpose is. I think if your purpose is carbon sequestration to meet climate change targets, I think we have to be really careful about doing the right type of tree planting, is how I would think of it, in that you might have an option to plant a monoculture of trees, which in the short term looks great on paper, that you planted thousands of trees in one go, and maybe you're planting really fast growing trees. But realistically, if you're planting a monoculture all of the same in neat little lines, that's not really going to be benefiting biodiversity. Whereas if you allow more natural regeneration of mixed forest, yes, that will happen over a slower period of time, but actually the potential benefits of carbon sequestration coupled with how much biodiversity of species it can hold, how it will be, nutrient recycling, the ability of that forest to be able to retain water, to prevent floods downstream. I think for me, where possible, the ideal is to go for mixed forest. So I'm always conscious of this idea of greenwashing. So companies or any organization saying, oh, we're great, we're planting lots of trees, to always be critical and say, okay, but which trees are you planting? And is it a monoculture? Is it natural? And are they all in these little awful plastic tubes, which I know seem to be the only thing which stop deer grazing them. But
yes, well, we seem to be planting a lot of plastic tubes at the moment, that's for sure, irrespective of what the long-term outcome will be. Georgie.
So it's a really interesting issue for us on the farmland for quite a few reasons. Just take it back to Hope Farm to start with and what we're doing there. So a lot of the species that are struggling on farmland to survive or are in decline, a lot of the farmland birds, they actually need the big open fields to breed and survive. So things like skylarks, lapwings, corn buntings, planting a load of trees in a field that has a lot of those species doing well might not necessarily be a good thing for biodiversity. Just to put another point of view in there. Having said that, we have a project to plant new trees in at Hope Farm. So we're starting an agroforestry project. And we're quite lucky that we have years of monitoring behind us to look at which fields might be less skylarky or lapwingy, but we can sort of follow basic principles of knowing what those kind of species need to know whether it's appropriate to put trees. And that kind of boils down to this whole right tree, right place kind of thing. Yeah. So if there's a really brilliant plant-rich, chalky grassland meadow, that's probably better left as is.
Exactly.
Peatland bogs, they're another thing that we're working on, not at Hope Farm, but with an RSPB, and actually restoring them from built up conifer woodlands to something that is doing an amazing job. Wet peatland bogs, they can do an amazing job of sequestering carbon. So I think it all comes down to looking at the land use, whether that's for growing food, whether that's growing trees for food, or whether that is something else altogether. When you picked up on timber as well, Tony, I think there's a lot of potential there, but we've just got to be careful we're not using more energy growing the tree for timber and transporting it to its final use for burning it, thinking it's better than non-renewable fuels when it might actually still be it's not doing a good job of sequestering carbon at all.
No, quite. And there's much complexity here. It's a kind of a clash between reality and popular culture in some ways, because tree planting now, almost every major organization you look at, banks, supermarkets, governments, the tree planting has become, the environmental solution. Kind of everybody gets it, and therefore it's very simple. But if you start thinking about it for a nanosecond, you realize this incredible level of complexity, especially when you go in through one particular reason. And so the current carbon obsession linked with tree planting, it kind of shades out, if that's a reasonable way of putting it, all the other benefits that we could get at the same time. So wildlife recovery, beautiful landscapes, public health and access and well-being benefits. You can clean up rivers using trees in the right kind of design in the catchment. You can slow down flooding, and you can reduce air pollution, and you can produce timber. And so how we get that mix, it's far from simple, but I think what you're both saying is, the need for an integrated approach and not just getting obsessed with, any particular single outcome, which is what politics often likes, and certainly the media likes to talk straightforwardly about one thing, in this case, carbon.
Yeah,
now,
and
yeah,
I think I was just going to say also, I think it's also worth bearing in mind that, I mean, I completely agree with you. It's a good thing, I think, when we have these nice, as conservationists, when we have these nice pithy phrases that people can cling on to, whether it's, 2 degrees for climate change, whether, no matter how much you know about climate change, 2 degrees will mean something to you. Oh, that's the boundary, we can't go over 2 degrees. Or tree planting. Oh, I understand that tree planting is good. And I feel like a bit of a buzzkill kind of then going, it has to be the right kind of planting. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that although tree planting done in the right way is great, I think in terms of, if we're talking about climate change and carbon sequestration, actually there are other forms of habitat which potentially provide a lot more carbon benefits than tree planting does. So, for example, peatland, I think, accounts for something like 3% of the Earth's surface, and yet also accounts for around a third of all carbon that's locked away. There's massive potential for, firstly, restoring peatland to capture more carbon, but to prevent more carbon being released in the first place. I think that's partly why there's such a big campaign at the minute asking people to buy peat-free compost, but also blue carbon. So seagrass meadows in marine environments have huge potentials for locking up carbon. So again, there's all this kind of nuance and complexity there once you get past that tree planting first entry point.
Exactly. The British government, to be fair, has got a very strong emphasis on peat in that nature for climate fund, which is good, and for all the reasons you say. And of course, coastal ecosystems, seagrasses, one you talked about, the other is salt marsh, where apparently there is often more carbon held in a hectare of salt marsh around the British coast than there is in a hectare of tropical rainforest, which is quite an astonishing statistic, and just reminds us of the need to keep that data in mind as we're making these choices about which ecosystems do what job. Very good. Now we have another question here from Prathayusha Parakala. I apologize if I've mangled your name, but hopefully that was nearly right, at least. Now your question is, 2021 to 2030 is the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. How can it be ensured that it is successful and we don't finish up expressing concerns at the end of it? Now, of course, this question comes just in the wake of the recent review of the Aichi targets adopted in 2010 by the Convention on Biological Diversity. 20 targets, as I recall, globally, none of which we met. Now, how are we going to get some optimism about the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration? George?
Oh, at least it's a simple question to answer, isn't it? No, I think it's a really good point. And yeah, looking at kind of the Aichi targets and where we've got on kind of biodiversity targets is quite pitiful. Yeah, I think, as we said for those of you that have seen the ELP video that was launched earlier today, we said it in there that, we're kind of past the point of arguing whether there is a problem or not, whether there is an issue. We know that we don't have time to discuss whether there is an issue anymore. And we're also beyond that in that there's so much work, conservation and restoration, that's happened over the last couple of decades, that we also now have enough solutions, enough techniques, enough knowledge to actually go and do something. So I think we have to base this around action rather than kind of talking about change happening. My personal view is that we have to get that balance between, I guess, kind of state government and kind of the private sector and charity sector, right, in terms of where does the responsibility lie in kind of delivering these targets. I think personally that state governments can be really helpful at providing kind of an incentive for, as you were talking before, Tony, about kind of directing the flow of decision making. I don't think it's wholly a government's responsibility to deliver these changes, but I think they play a really important role in incentivizing certain mechanisms which the private sector and landowners and things will respond to. I think it's also really important that I think for me, the thing that's really important is that we create a space, which I don't think we have fully at the moment, which allows people make mistakes in conservation and in restoration, and to learn from them. I think, yeah, we just need a lot more empathy. Generous is a slightly different point, really, but yeah, I think there has to be we have to have a safe space to make mistakes and learn from them and just get going. You know, we can't get it's important to have discussion about what works and what doesn't work. But at a certain point, we just have to do something. Even our own within our CCI partnership of 9 biodiversity conservation organisations, they don't agree on everything. It's not to say that one is wrong and one's right, but we'd be wasting time if we sat there debating. It's completely context specific.
Indeed. Georgie.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what you said, George. It's time to take action. And I think there needs to be more accountability as well, for whether we do satisfy the targets or not. There are some people that say conservation and climate action, it shouldn't be made political because it's everybody's responsibility, which is quite interesting. Governments, they change every 3 years and are looking for short-term gains that are going to win popularity at the end of the day, which it's just how the system works. That there needs to be some long-term accountability for that, and maybe looking to markets and empowering and sort of incentivizing for markets to make big changes. That might be a solution to it. It's a really tricky one to tackle, and I don't think that comes anywhere near to answering the question, except for giving a few pointers.
No, but as you're both pointing out, it's almost an impossible question to answer. This period, however, that we're going into now, I have to say that this is very different to the period before the negotiation of the Aichi targets. And I think one of the most significant differences that now prevails, and it is political, Georgie, I think you're right. It's something that affects everybody. That is going to be about politics, no matter how you look at it. And so these questions, they do go into that big political realm. But one thing that has shifted compared with 10 years ago is the consensus that is now there, and it's in science, but it's also helpfully beginning to be visible in politics, is the view that nature, we had to liquidate nature to grow the economy. We're now getting into a period where we know that if we liquidate nature much more, we're not going to have any economy at all. And so that is changing the political discussion, the extent to which looking after nature is not only about birds and bats, it's actually about the future of humankind. And I think that does give us some level of optimism for this decade to hopefully finish up in a different place to where we did with the Aichi targets, and big global summit this year, of course, as well.
And I'd be interested to know, Tony, I don't know if we're allowed to ask you a question back, but how does it feel differently for you in terms of the public perception? So for me, I think the other thing at the moment is that it feels as though the public, thankfully, are more kind of engaged in this as a topic. And I think the other opportunity we have is the public holding businesses, governments to account. Do you feel that's different than?
Oh yes, 30 years ago? Yeah, things have definitely shifted a long way, and it is becoming the case now where an understanding of nature and its beauty and its value to people, it's becoming much more culturally resonant. Now, I don't know if anyone is dull enough to watch, what do they call it, Gardeners Weekly or something on the BBC Two programme last night. I just happened to tune into that with Monty Don, and I was just struck.
I watched Gardener's World. Nothing wrong with Monty Don. World. Yeah. Okay, yeah. I want his life. I want all the dogs. I want all of it.
Yeah, exactly. But did you notice, George, how much that was about nature, that programme yesterday? It was about beautiful gardens full of wildlife. Okay, well, it's worth catching it on the iPlayer, just from the point of view of just detecting a cultural shift. And during this whole lockdown piece as well, with this connection to green space, it's leading into quite a lot of media coverage about going outside and being in natural areas. And when you get that bottom-up cultural shift at the same time as an understanding at the top of politics based upon some of these new economic ideas, I think that's when you get the momentum that takes us somewhere very different. And I think we're on the verge of that. So when we sit here in 10 years' time and do one of these, we can see whether we were right or not. Now, let's have a look at another question. So Charlotte is asking us, about the rise of the popularity of veganism and vegetarianism, and whether this is leading towards a shift towards producing more plants and fewer animals. Now, both of you will have a view on this, not least because rewilding, one of the things we can do with that is produce very good meat, whereas some people may say we shouldn't be eating any meat. So what do you think, Georgie? You're probably closest to trends in farming and can see whether farmers are giving up livestock for crops.
I think less but better is probably better overall, is my general feeling on it. So we are an arable farm at Hope Farm, but are actually looking at including livestock back into the system in a more integrated way. So farming used to be mixed farming, where you'd have the animals and the crops there, and then we had this sort of strange polarization where everything on the east and particularly towards the south became crops only, and all of the livestock moved over to the west side of the country. Livestock, so on other places at Haweswater and Geltsdale, which are upland sites owned by the RSP Upland Farms, they've reduced their livestock, which has helped with their water quality management. It's actually meant the business has made more money because the livestock is living off of the land and the cost of the inputs is much reduced. So I think that's a much better way of going. Using the livestock as a management system is something that we're looking to implement at Hope Farm. So there are opportunities for growing cover crops over winter, which is a sacrificial crop. And if you graze sheep on it for 3 weeks, that can produce, we did some really, this is really rough figures, but 10 kilograms of nitrogen was what we really roughly estimated we could put on by putting 30 sheep on that land for 3 weeks. And that can help graze off weeds, that could add organic matter, and it can provide an extra bit of nitrogen, which it reduces our inorganic inputs. So I think taking livestock out of the system will reduce the opportunities there. But I do think at the moment we are eating far more than we need to, because it is still a high energy food source for us to produce.
Right. Yes, and if you did move towards lower meat consumption, then that would be compatible with those kinds of methods of integrating livestock into the wider agricultural system. And I guess the thing that many people are most concerned about, quite rightly, is not so much a mixed agricultural system whereby animals are being combined in a good way with arable and horticulture. It's the excesses of factory farming, and the deforestation of the Amazon to make way for soya beans to be fed to cattle in a cage. And that couldn't be more different from your description of a mixed farm that is replenishing soil and doing that in a good way. George, I guess you come across some of these agricultural and livestock issues in the kind of big landscape space. NEP is a good example to my mind of where that particular enterprise, which has done so much for wildlife, is actually making a little bit of income from producing what is effectively semi-wild meat.
Yeah, so I think I agree with what Georgie says, actually. So I'm vegetarian, have been for a number of years, although I might sneak some chicken on my plate or a couple of pigs and blankets at Christmas, and not give myself a hard time. And that's just really because I personally find it very easy to take meat out of my diet. I don't particularly miss it. I know that other people really enjoy meat. So I don't think personally the answer is for everyone to become vegan, everyone to become vegetarian, because as Georgie says, there are livestock animals, particularly, pigs and cows, that can actually perform a kind of ecosystem service within that landscape. And that's exactly what they've done at NEP. I suppose I do have a concern about the production of that kind of, not the production of that meat, but the fact that it becomes this kind of premium meat and is then very expensive to reflect the way that food has been produced. And so I think then you can have some ethical questions about, well, who is able to actually afford that meat if everyone was to follow that pattern? So I suppose if I were waving a magic wand, we would have everywhere in a system like NEP with low density of farming. And if that meant that the price was bumped up, that would somehow be subsidized by the government, so that lower income families, it didn't become kind of a class issue. Because I think that's already an issue we have at the moment, is that if you want to make the more sustainable, environmentally friendly option, whether you're talking about food, makeup, toiletries, where you get your furniture from, the vast majority of the time, if you want the more environmentally friendly option, you have to pay more, which just seems completely backwards to me. So that was something I would want to be taken into account. A couple of our projects, livestock and farming are very, very much part of those landscapes. It depends on which context you're talking about, but I think across the board, I suppose if we think about sheep farming, I think they've particularly kind of suffered, and with there being more of a move towards kind of vegetarian and veganism, and also that particularly in the UK context, the whole thing of Brexit and what's happening to payments. And so what all of our projects are doing actually are trying to provide benefits to people, so creating new opportunities. So I think when we think about making space for nature, it's not just about physical space for nature, but actually by restoring landscapes on that scale, you can create new spaces for people in terms of new economies, new jobs, new opportunities to connect with landscapes. There has to be benefits for people there too. And so, yeah, my hope is that healthy landscapes will help to provide new opportunities where maybe agriculture isn't quite as financially viable as it has been in the past.
Thank you both. I think what we conclude from that is that veganism was probably a bit like tree planting, i.e. generally a good idea, but quite complicated when one starts to dig into the details. Good, thank you both. Right, now the top scoring question at the moment in terms of what people would like to talk about is from M. Hurst, and M asks, how can we encourage government and other organisations to take action? Pretty simple question. We've both touched on the importance of policy and politics, haven't we? And also indeed companies. Any views there? Do you know what? The other day, I was just looking at social media and I asked myself the question in terms of getting people to take action, what's more effective? Do we make them angry or do we inspire them? So that might be a good starting point in terms of how we encourage people to take action, and actually goes to the heart of this discussion about optimism, doesn't it? Are we going to give people hope or are we going to make them terrified? So maybe a couple of axes there, hope versus terror, anger versus inspiration. What do you both think is going to be the better way? Georgie?
I mean, I hope, using the word hope far too much here, aren't I? But I hope it won't become as extreme as sort of hope and terror. But one thing that's waved around an awful lot that seems to be quite effective is carrot and stick. Yeah, which I guess is a more friendly way of saying the same thing. How to encourage government and organisations to take action? I think you need to have a bit of both of those. It is a really difficult question to answer, but I think there needs to be a pull from public so that we can say, and so that we can all agree on what we want. I think with the government, they can take action, but there needs to be a clear agreement from us lot, start off conservation organisations to all agree on a simple and clear message on what we want to happen, and beyond conservation organisations in farming. There are many more sectors involved in food production. Of course, there's the NFU, there are the supermarkets, there are the people buying the food as well, and buying all of the other products that we can produce. If we can all agree on what is the right way forward, then it'll be much easier to take action, I guess.
Yes, thank you. George, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's a simple question, really not an easy answer, is it? I think in response to the question that was being asked, I think as Georgie said, it's this idea of kind of carrot and stick putting pressure in the right places. And for me, it's kind of rewarding in the right places, whether you're talking about governments or businesses. So I think for me, it's about applying pressure and holding, whether you're talking about companies or governments, accountable for their actions, and trying to prompt them to make changes, whether that's on an individual level in terms of writing to your own MP or having a conversation with your gardening centre manager, I don't know, whatever it might be. I do generally have a concern about a lot of pressure being placed on the individual versus kind of on a system level. But I think it's important to apply pressure where it's needed, but also to reward companies and governments when they do something right. So not just give them a hard time for doing things wrong, but actually if you found a company that's, you know, ethical and it's environmentally friendly and it's doing something that you think is good, share that on social media, tell your friends and family about it. It can't just be all about this negative messaging. And in terms of your follow-up point about kind of fear versus, you know, inspiration and optimism, I feel very strongly about, I'm not a massively opinionated person, but this is one thing I feel very strongly about, is that I just don't think that fear is going to get us anywhere. And actually one narrative over this last year in particular, which has troubled me quite a bit, is this idea that, oh, humans are a plague and nature would be better off without us. And I just think that's such a dangerous thought process, because in thinking that, you're kind of robbing yourself of any agency to make change. Humans aren't a plague on nature. There are many examples of where nature can benefit from human intervention. It's about changing the relationship that we have with nature and making it more reciprocal than it has been in the past. And I think we have to, it's not just about inspiration, but actually, without sounding too kind of Gaia and hokey pokey about it, like, I think we have to be, love and empathy and understanding and respect are far more powerful actually than fear is, and that's what we have to lead with. I think if we try and fuel our tank from anger and fear, we're just gonna burn ourselves out. Although they're valid, totally valid emotions, I think in the long term, we have to be led by optimism.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree with you more both. Georgie, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, can I just take on the sort of the organisations in government? Perhaps you wouldn't call them organisations, but they're groups of people that can make a big change and are probably quite similar to a lot of other people as farmers. So farmers can make a massive change to the landscape management. There are different ways where it's tried to be done. So, for instance, if you want farmers to integrate their land management so they're not relying on pesticides too much, there are current tick box things in place that farmers need to do to show that they're doing that kind of management, and it's not really working. It is a simple exercise that doesn't trigger a lot of thought, and it doesn't change the way farmers think about managing their system that much. So it's kind of a minimal effort job done. And I think the old versions of the current countryside stewardship schemes, they also did that. Things have changed now so that there are more opportunities for farmers to do habitat management and that kind of thing, but there's almost too much of the fear of there's too much of the fear. So there's too much worry about losing all of their payments when they've put in a lot of effort to managing, losing a lot of money, a lot of additional stress for them, not that much gain. And I hope, or I get the feeling that things are now moving so that farmers are being given a clearer, or when we talk to farmers on our Hope Farm and give farmers a clear idea of what good looks like, there's loads of ideas that they've got on how they can get there. And I think businesses are the same. They know their business and how it works. If they're showed what good looks like and given the right support or opportunities to do that, then you get the innovation, and that's how you get the change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And that, I think that kind of feeds into what I was saying earlier about creating a space where people are allowed to be honest and talk about mistakes and things that haven't gone well. I think if you have a space where people can't do that, you don't get innovation, because no one will be brave enough to try anything differently. And I also love what you said about kind of trying to tackle this polarization. You can't tar everyone with the same brush. You know, conservationists don't have to be against farmers, vegans don't have to be against farmers either. You know, farmers just generally seem to get a rough ride. Everyone's just trying to get by.
Yeah, that's right. It does strike me that the nature of discussion, not just in conservation but generally in society, has shifted over recent years to be much angrier and polarized, and much less tolerance of other views, which is quite an interesting backdrop to all of this, because there's so many dimensions to this conservation story, and pretty much all of them, whether ones we just talked about or others we've not talked about today, they've all got a spectrum of views in there, and how you handle that spectrum of views to be able to encourage action rather than another argument actually is really quite an important question. We've got a little bit coming through on the chat here as well, which is related to that. Now, how are we doing for time? We've got a few minutes, I think. Anne Catherine Sharp asks, and it's a question for George, but both of you will have a view on this. What kind of indicators are used to measure successful restoration at a landscape scale? And so you're working in two kind of parallel worlds, one trying to restore biodiversity in agricultural landscapes, the other in recreating the health of ecosystems at a broader scale. Do you have, I wonder, any convergence in terms of what good looks like? So the point is really about indicators to measure successful outcomes. How are you both coping with that question? What kind of data are you looking for?
Shall I take it at the small scale, and then George can go at the big scale?
Yeah.
So there are lots of different outputs that we try and achieve at Hope Farm. So there's the one that has remained for a long time is food production. Profitability, that's profitability, not yield. If you're maximizing your input, so spending a lot of money to grow your crops, but then not getting that much more from it, you're not making as much money. So that's kind of the important thing. How much biodiversity we've got there is something we measure at Hope Farm, but there's no reason that can't be a measure across other farms, perhaps in slightly different methods that don't require as much monitoring as we've got. But you can go by habitat quality, as there is quite a good indicator of that. The soil health, which we are constantly monitoring, because if the soil health isn't good, the crops are going to be more susceptible to disease, drought. They're not going to grow as well anyway, so that's going to reduce the profit. And a new one is our carbon as well, our organic matter in our soil, which is again linked to soil health, linked to how the crops grow. A lot of the measures we put in place that can help to reduce our carbon footprint, although I'm sure there are some that aren't as good for biodiversity, a lot of them that we implement, like hedgerows, cover crops, adding organic matter to the soil, reducing our cultivations, they're also good for the others as well. So they're some of our key measurements, but they are all completely interlinked.
Thank you.
George.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think monitoring to get evidence of what does and doesn't work in restoration is so important. And we recognise that with ELP projects, they're quite unique in the scale that they're working at. We're talking kind of tens of thousands of hectares. In fact, our Paledia project, which cuts across Belarus and Ukraine, I think totals almost 1 million hectares. So these are really huge scale that we're talking about. Yeah. And I think kind of feeding into an earlier question about how we deliver on the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, I think where the ELP can really contribute is from learning from its projects. So we have 8 implementation projects, these kind of large scale multi-million-dollar projects happening over a period of 5 or 6 years across Europe. So they're really brilliant case studies. And so actually as part of their application stage to the programme, when they were kind of shortlisted, and they all had to complete and create a very robust monitoring framework where they have a number of indicators, across different themes which they are monitoring against over the next 5 years. So these might be ecological indicators, so monitoring certain species populations, or soil health, water quality, also social indicators, kind of how many visitors they've had to landscapes, how many people the projects have reached through their events and communications, but also economic indicators, making sure that real value is actually being delivered to people. So what impact are these hopefully restored landscapes having on the number of jobs that are being created, the money, the income for people? So I think that information, I mean, these projects are only like 2.5 years into implementation now. So they're just, and we have kind of as a kind of program level, we have what we call our kind of program results framework. So each project has their own indicators that they monitor against for their particular project. And then we have kind of a high level framework at a program level that we've asked all the projects to report against to us. So over the years, we'll have hopefully a nice summary of things going up and looking better and better. But I think it's so important, to make sure that you're actually creating evidence for what works and what doesn't.
Yes, indeed. And you both emphasised in slightly different ways the importance of the social and economic data alongside the ecological data. As you were saying, Georgie, if you can show farmers that they're going to make more money as part of the process of getting the wildlife back on farmland, it's going to make life so much easier, isn't it, in encouraging people to want to do that. And similarly, in remote rural areas, if rewilding is going to bring jobs to parts of countries that have seen some historic decline, we're going to get so much further than if in both cases we were talking only about eagles or yellow hammers. If you talk jobs and economics as part of that same plan, I think this just transforms the conservation, the conversation about conservation in the sense of, people not seeing it as a threat to what they might otherwise wish to do, whether they're in government or business. So thank you both. Yes, and interesting times on indicators as the Environment Bill goes through Parliament in this country. There will be a target framework established in law there, which will raise some of these questions. And actually an interesting thought there as to how you blend in the social and the economic. I'm sure people are thinking about that. Right, let's have a look. We are getting a bit short of time. I think we've got time for one or two more. Oh, here's a good one to kind of, maybe we'll close on this one. I think we're running out of space. This will get you both thinking. Do you think wildlife will ever fully recover from human activity? Discuss, Georgie. Well, you're finding some great results there, aren't you? Astonishing results, I think we would say, in relation to what you've done at Hope Farm. So you can leave us with an air of optimism, I dare say, Georgie.
Oh, I do hope so. So do you think wildlife will ever recover from human activity? So on farmland, nature really is integrated with the human activity that goes on there. Skylarks, they originally evolved to live on steppe grassland, but now they are completely integrated with the spring cropping, and with just a small tweak with the winter cereal crops as well. Lapwings, they are again completely integrated with it. Yellow hammers, and I'm talking about sort of the bird species, I guess RSPB, that's a bit obvious, but a lot of nature is completely integrated with it as well. And that can be for good and bad. So if that means lots of pest species, that isn't particularly helpful. But the more we integrate nature as a whole and make it more biodiverse, the more stable it becomes and the better we do at sort of stabilizing the system and encouraging the beneficial insects. So for us, there's a lot that we can do to recover what damage we might have done on farmland for wildlife in the last 50 years or so. But if you only go back 50 years, we have monitoring that shows we had turtle doves in abundance, tree sparrows, even spotted flycatchers were about on the farm. So that's not to say that even in a human managed system, these species can't do really well. And I think that's kind of thing. It's it doesn't work to say, right, nature exists over here and is segregated, we cannot touch it, and humans work over here. We are completely, George, I think you've picked on it already, we are completely integrated with it.
We're embedded in it, deeply embedded. George, anything to add to what Georgie said?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, hearing it phrased that way of, do we think that nature will ever recover from human impacts? So that almost makes me think as though we're trying to get back to a particular point in time. And that in turn makes me feel as though recovery is something that's finite, as though at some point we will reach a stage where we say, oh, we've got enough birds, we've got enough ecosystem, enough ecosystem services. And I think this isn't a finite thing, actually. I think, and it does depend on the context. So in some places we have done irreparable damage. We've lost many, many species. So in that sense, those species, obviously, that part of nature won't ever recover. In some contexts, I think we can get ecosystems back to a point of function that they have been in the past, so that they're working naturally. For me, I don't know that it's always helpful to become obsessed with getting ecosystems back to a state they were in a point in time. I think it has to work in the way that the world is now. I think it's more about giving ecosystems the space to kind of express themselves naturally and fully, in the same way that we look at animal welfare. An animal should have the right to express itself naturally and fully, and it's the same with an ecosystem. But I think we can go one step better than that in a lot of places and actually say, let's not just recover nature until a point of before human intervention. Let's leave it better than actually how we found it. I think when we think about any kind of recovery, things won't ever be the same as they have been in the past. I don't think there's any point looking back in that sense. Things will always be different, but they can also be better. It's, I think we've learned that this year in COVID. It's completely normal for us to grieve the loss of a world that we won't have anymore. We're going to be changed forevermore by this experience that we've collectively gone through, and our world will recover, we will recover, but we won't ever be completely the same again. And that's not a bad thing. I think it just depends on what your definition of recovery is, if that makes sense.
Great. Well, both really, really fascinating and fantastic answers to what is a very big question. I was just reflecting the other day with a colleague about some of the ways in which perceptions have altered over time in relation to this. I remember as a small child, literally in the 1960s, looking at bird books and being obsessed with peregrine falcons. And I thought, I'm never going to see one of these things. And you'd read about, how they died out, they'd been hunted to near extinction, and then they'd been hit on top of that by pesticide poisoning of DDT and what have you. And, you kind of reach the view, well, people and wildlife are not really compatible. They can't live together. And, these birds now live in these remote coastal areas. And you have to go to wild parts of the country to see them. But then, some decades later, we now know that, if you stop doing the things that cause those things to disappear, i.e. stop shooting them and stop poisoning them, they will do absolutely fine. And I can walk down the road here now, and in central Cambridge, actually near to the David Attenborough building, there's a peregrine falcon's nest on a building there. And last year they fledged 3 chicks right in the centre of town. I was talking to a friend the other day who was telling me about beavers nesting. They've got a lodge next to a supermarket in Somerset, just next to the car park, and people watch those animals there. And, that question, I think in the end, do you think wildlife will ever fully recover from human activity? I think nature will recover perfectly well if we give it the chance. I think it's the upshot. And then that's about our mindset and whether we do want to embrace nature as part of our human existence and to really recognize the fact that we're embedded in it. And the more we know about the benefits of looking after it, hopefully the easier this becomes. Fine. George, go ahead. And to say, have a final little wrap up, any final remarks you'd like to make?
Yeah, I guess just as a final point to that question about will nature ever properly recover and will wildlife ever properly recover, I think, as Georgie was saying before, we're not separate from nature. I think thinking about our recovery, we should be, it's about our recovery too, in that the world that has been built around kind of extraction and taking more hasn't necessarily it hasn't created a good world for us either. You know, we're suffering in terms of being overworked. We have rampant inequalities in terms of how those resources have been distributed. So I think we can create a better world that's not just better for nature, but works better for us too. I think we are part of that recovery too.
Thank you. Georgie, any final reflections before we wind up?
Yeah, I just think a final remark on that. It's been a really interesting conversation. And I do think on this whole recovery, there is so much we can do to help work with nature better. And it's about changing the relationship we have with nature, and looking to that for the solutions rather than fighting against it. Just going back to farmland, it amazes me every year when things come round. At Hope Farm, not everything's perfect. We might do something on the land and think, oh gosh, that soil doesn't look great. We've had to do a measure that has meant, I don't know, if worm populations were down in a field once because of the management that had happened on a couple of years that weren't appropriate. And I thought, gosh, what's happened here? This is such a high profile farm. We shouldn't be doing this. And then within a couple of years, I now look at the worm populations that are in there that are a great indicator of soil biology. And it's just booming. The worms that you normally get one every metre, there'll be 10 of them in a metre squared. And that is just by changing the management, like what you said, Tony, figure out what you're doing wrong and stop doing it, and find out the things that work positively and do more of that, really.
Very good. Thank you both for those final thoughts, which I have to say leaves me with a lot of optimism for the future. You've both shared inspiring perspectives today derived from the work that you're both doing. It's been my absolute pleasure to sit here and have a conversation with you for the last hour. I do hope everybody who has been tuning in has found this as of much interest as I have. I apologise that we didn't get through all of the questions. We couldn't do because there were too many of them. But thank you all for sharing those prompts to what turned into a really very wide-ranging conversation and touching on some pretty big and broad subjects. And if we can continue with that process in the conservation community of tackling the big subjects and feeding them into what we're doing with our different projects and initiatives, I do think over this next decade we will be seeing some very big positive change. So thank you all for coming today. If you didn't see George and Georgie's film, then do go to the website and check those out, and you will enjoy them. And I'm told that Sir David Attenborough will be here tomorrow, joining the conversation with Liz Bonin, TV presenter many of you will know of, and they will be in conversation, so that will be something that we shouldn't miss. So thanks everybody for being here today, and I'm now going to hand back, to the organisers of Earth Optimism.